Hello, this is Kade, and today I wanted to talk to you about the Idris class frigate from Star Citizen. Just like I've done previously talking about the RSI Polaris class corvette, I thought I would go and take a look at the Idris in a somewhat similar manner. And really call it short is that the Idris is the ultimate lone wolf that's just in the universe right now. But before we really go into talking about the Idris itself, let's look a bit at what is a frigate. Because what is a frigate has of course changed a lot, like any other designation for ships. So what we're going to do is take a look at what they were in World War II, which is of course the combat styles around which this game is a little bit envisioned, and how they are being considered today. Looking at World War II, the term frigate was used to note a ship that was larger than a corvette, smaller than a destroyer, and generally built for anti-submarine warfare. One of the things that was fairly important for these things is like, okay, it needed to be bigger than a corvette and it needed to have a different hull shape, because the corvettes, they are not happy in open oceans. They're really not happy ships. Their hulls are just not really well suited for that. So they changed a hull shape that's more suitable for open ocean work. They went from a single shaft on a corvette to a double shaft, which increases maneuverability. But they keep the mercantile style of shipbuilding. So this means that these ships are essentially unarmored. But it also means that any shipyard can build them. So that's fairly handy to have. And speed-wise, they are a fair bit slower than destroyers, but really to deal with submarines, in World War II you don't really need a lot of speed because submerged submarines were really slow. So that was a frigate in World War II. And for those of you who don't realize, is that the destroyer escort term used within the US Navy is really interchangeable with the term frigate that the British used, because they're really the same thing. If you look at the modern times, frigates are just about anything. I mean, literally anything. I mean, ships the size of corvettes to really battleship size ships have been called frigates. So, what is a frigate? Well, yeah. Modern day times? Who knows? Let's just put it this way, frigate is a really popular term to use to call a ship class. You know, this is a frigate class or vessel. Why? Because it doesn't sound mean. You know, it sounds very neutral. It doesn't sound like it's one of those very large ships. I mean, if you talk to somebody like this is a cruiser, people will have in their minds the image of a much larger ship. If you say it's a battleship, they're gonna have an even larger image size in their mind. If you're saying it is a destroyer, they get a very aggressive image in their mind. But if you call it a frigate, for most people a frigate is like lift their shoulders and like, sure. You know, they don't really have instantly an image to put with a frigate. And that's why it's such an ideal classification. Because in modern day times, if you want to get your ships for the Navy, you need to convince politicians, and of course you need to make sure that the public doesn't go all crazy on you for spending God knows how much money on new ships. So calling a ship a frigate is really popular. It makes it easier on the public and on the politicians for the navies to convince them to get them their ships that are actually destroyers or even cruisers. But because we say it's a frigate, it's alright. Yeah, you can have yourself some frigates. That's quite alright. Sure, it'll be fine. So that's frigates, World War II and today. Now let's take a look in the game, and of course to do that we can best compare it to what we have already. So we have ourselves the Idris Frigate, we have ourselves the Polaris corvette, and we have of course ourselves the Javelin Destroyer. So how can we qualify these things? Well, with the Polaris I said it's a corvette heavy torpedo bomber blend, so it's a bit of an oddball ship because it's not really a capital ship. I mean, it doesn't have capital ship great weapons or capital ship class shields, but it's for what it needs to be doing. You know, a fairly cheap, large, capable platform. It's ideal. Looking at the Idris, and here we're seeing capital ship class weapons, capital ship class shields, and the capability to have a 3 fighter wing on board, which is very handy. Then if we go and take a step up, we're looking at the Javelin Destroyer. We say that we're losing out on the fighter wing, we just go down to 1 hangar. And in return we get a lot more weapons. And hence for the Javelin Destroyer, I think it's a little bit of a destroyer leaning on light cruiser type of deal. And with the Idris, I would say it is more a frigate leaning on destroyer territory. And the reasoning for this is weapons. Quite traditionally, a frigate does not really have very capable anti-ship weapon systems. You know, they have some, but they're not gonna have the big guns. Like generally when you're talking about some destroyer escorts had some 5 inches, but really for a destroyer to be a good destroyer, you're talking about generally at least 4 5-inch guns. You know, good quality 5-inch guns, and a whole array of torpedoes to give it a little bit of a bonus to deal with the larger ships. So that's your capability on the weapon side. And of course, when in game we have our capital class ship weapon right here on top under the railgun. Of course, the P doesn't have that, but let's just consider that we have the capability to have those weapons. We have beside that several other large caliber weapons on board, good missile turret. So overall, you know, we're really filling it's not really a destroyer, but it's also not really a frigate, so it's really in a bit of a limbo in between. So what makes this ship so good and what makes it so popular? Well, it comes down a bit to economics. Like if you have a fairly small organization and you're not going to be primarily focused on combat, it is unlikely that you want to have an Idris. You know, maybe you'll have a Polaris because they're relatively cheap to maintain and operate as a security force for whatever you're doing, and that's going to serve you well. However, if you're a small organization and that's focusing towards combat, then the Idris is a really, really nice ship to have. And the reason is, as I said in the beginning, I call it the ultimate lone wolf. Because the Idris is really ideal to patrol on its own or in smaller groups. But the key here is it can patrol on its own. And that's where the economics come in. Because the Idris can patrol on its own because its weapon systems are capable of dealing with ships of its own size and smaller ships, and it has the fighters on board as well to intercept any threats on a further distance away, which means that you can disable any threat before they threaten the main ship. If we compare this to the Javelin Destroyer, it doesn't have this capability. I mean, its weapons are, you're talking about sizing up, it's really about fighting other capital class vessels. It's not so much about fighting off fighter wings and things like that. So as soon as you're going out to fly around in the Javelin, you want to have an escort. This escort can be relatively simple with a bunch of long-range fighters, so say you got a bunch of vanguards. Or, if you're really going further away, you really want to be talking about escorting it with maybe a Polaris, or even better, an Idris or 2. And that's where the economics come in. It's up to the level of about the Constellation and Retaliator. You're looking at ships that you can operate on their own independently, safely, in combat situations we're talking about, so not anything outside of combat, on your own and be quite effective. As soon as you start to get above that, things you start to need crew and other things. So for the Polaris, you'll need a crew. You just need a crew, and ideally maybe a pilot for the single fighter that you have on board. So, instead of just yourself, you start to have a crew that needs to be paid. You want actually players or elite crew to deal with the more advanced tasks. So the costs of operating that ship in a combat situation are going up. exponentially towards the actual firepower that you're getting offered. But of course, in exchange for that, you get things like longer range and other things. Then we're going towards the Idris, and again, you need your crew, but you also need the fighters on board. You need pilots for the fighters, and you need a lot more crew. So the costs are getting quite steep to operate this ship, in a combat situation. But as soon as you get past the Idris, the exponential curve, it's quite shallowish right now. But as soon as you get past that level of the Idris and go to the Javelin, it starts shooting up sky high. And the reason being is, as I said, with the Javelin, it's not a solo operating ship. It needs to have an escort if you're going out there. Because if you leave that thing without an escort, it's going to be hugely vulnerable to strikes from torpedo bombers and things like that. It just will not have the means to adequately defend itself against that. And it is a fairly large target, so people will be hunting for it if you're going out alone. Fairly good example of this is in World War II, of course, the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis. They sent it out without a destroyer escort, which was against all policies. I mean, it's fairly simple said, is that no ship larger than a destroyer shall sail out to sea without an escort. So, anything larger than a destroyer would have a destroyer or destroyer escorts escorting it, because they are capable of dealing with the type of threats that the larger ship was not capable of dealing with. I mean, a cruiser was not outfitted to deal with submarines. What happened? A submarine finds the cruiser and sinks the cruiser. Oops. A lot of people died. Not good. So there comes in the cost of operating the ship. While as with the Idris, I just need to have, I just need to spend what I need to run the ship and the fighters on board. With the Javelin, I need to spend what I need to, run the ship, its single fighter, and its escort. So the cost of operating ships above the Idris really starts to go higher and higher and higher and higher. And that's why I don't think that for a combat operation, if you really want to have a Javelin in your organization, I think you're looking at 200-300 people in your organization before you can start to support fielding a Javelin. Because it's just that costly, it will need that many escorts, and it will need that many people online to operate it. Whereas with the Idris, you can just go out in your Idris alone. And that's also what they're going to be doing in the universe, and what you're also seeing in Squadron 42. These ships are the ideal patrol ships. They are going to be flying everywhere, keeping watch and making sure that nothing funky is going on. The reason why we have the Polaris being offered to do sort of that same role is it's just a lot cheaper. I mean, it comes in at half the cost and much lower operating cost. So it means it is affordable for the more cash-strapped militias and smaller organizations. But if you have the money, like the Navy does, you will be patrolling with Idris-class frigates, because they are really designed for it. They got all the tools on board to do it. They have that small little fighter wing of those 3 fighters, so they can spread themselves out. They can send a fighter to scout out what's around the moon that they're going about, so they don't run into a trap and things like that. So that just makes them really, really great to stand on their own. And that's what makes them the ultimate lone wolf. And that's why they're going to be a very, very popular ship in the universe. Because I think an organization of about 50 people, if you're focusing on combat, will be able to maintain and operate one of these ships. So, small org, capable of running that Idris. If you're on your own, I'm not sure if they announced NPC capable fighter pilots yet, but even without those, I think you'll be relatively okay operating an Idris on your own. I would not advise it, but I think you could run it with a full NPC crew. Although I'm not sure what the latest confirmation is on that. Well, yeah, the Idris is the ultimate lone wolf. It is at that sweet spot, offering a great, great mix of capabilities at a price point that is, just right. I'm not saying it's cheap, because it's not gonna be cheap, but it's just right. It's a sweet spot between capabilities and price spent. If you go below that, you lose out on capabilities, well, you go cheaper. And if you go above that, you will get more capabilities, but the amount of money you spend for it gets exponentially higher. So, that was the Idris. The frigate / etching on destroyer. And I think what's going to be the most popular capital ship in the universe. I think both within NPC use and within player use. It's just that good for design and that useful in the roles that it will fill. Just one final note, it's not a main battleship, it's not going to be a mainline fighting ship. If these things are going to be in fleet engagements, they're going to be screening the fleet. They're not going to be engaging anything. Their job is to keep hostile fighters and torpedo bombers and Polaris frigates type of corvettes type ships away. Because really, if you're going for large fleet engagements, the destroyers are just the smaller ships that are actually going to be slugging it out. Anything smaller than that, it's just not capable of lasting in that kind of an environment. And it's just not designed for that. I mean, if you want to design this size of ship for a fleet engagement, you would just strip out the entire capabilities of having those fighters and put more guns on it. Because it's just more useful in a fleet engagement. In a fleet engagement, having 3 fighters on board does not matter at all. Because you have carriers. They'll have dozens, if not more, fighters on board. And a lot better facilities to launch them and maintain them and keep them in operation than you will have. But for a patrolling duty, for a singular unit ship that can be going out on its own, it's perfect. And yeah, this was Kade. I hope you enjoyed this one. I hope you found it somewhat informative. If you have any feedback, please leave it down below. And besides that, I thank you very much for watching. Until next time.